This segment of the training module will provide information regarding flood risk assessment data. The intended uses for flood risk assessment data include communicating relative flood risk for flood-prone areas, vulnerable people and property, providing estimates for property damage in a particular census, business interruption costs, costs for debris removal, and identifying locations with possible cost-effective mitigation options. Improving estimates quantifying flood risk, losses for FEMA's nationwide average annualized loss study, refined losses from new or revised studies, refined general building stock data from local sources. HAZUS estimates the flood loss from the flood depth grids and census block data. A national average annualized loss study was performed using HAZUS. The studies generated and data compiled through RiskMAP will allow for FEMA's mapping partners to perform a refined analysis using better data. This data can consist of new engineering studies, topography, property value administration, PVA data, and other types of data. FEMA developed the HAZUS average annualized loss study data to have a consistent comparison across the nation for risk assessment. The data is comprised of census and other data available at the national level. One of the goals of RiskMAP is to refine the study with better data derived from state and local sources. FEMA conducted an average annualized loss study as a way to improve on previous attempts of understanding flood risk for the nation. The AAL study was an out-of-the-box HAZUS Level 1 study using HAZUS MR4 software for the continental U.S. By using HAZUS default data such as 30-meter DEM terrain data and HAZUS default general building stock information, the AAL study was the first attempt by FEMA to model, not just approximate, risk for both riverine and coastal areas. Outputs from the study included information on total building exposure, total losses, and the loss ratio between these values, what percentage of structures and their content were damaged. These results were both for individual return period events and then combining into an average annualized loss value. These results were both for individual return period events and combined average annualized loss values. With the use of HAZUS and the AAL data, an estimation of losses for various flooding events can be determined for residential losses, commercial losses, and other assets. If content data is available, estimates for content losses can be made. The percent damage estimate can also be made for potential damages to the structure and the contents therein. Last, business disruptions can be estimated as well as potential population displaced by flooding events. The flood risk assessment data can also be used by communities to create alternative analyses that are more suited to their needs. Flood risk assessment datasets reflect potential flood damage estimates resulting from analysis of flood depth in developed areas. Flood risk assessment datasets will be primarily based on the HAZARDS US or HAZUS MR4 Average Annualized Loss AAL study and refined HAZUS analysis for new or updated flood study reaches. Flood risk assessment data is stored in the flood risk database and is used to create the community-specific tables presented in the flood risk report. The flood risk assessment dataset helps guide community mitigation efforts by quantifying potential future flood losses, thereby showing where flood mitigation actions may produce the highest return on investment. The HAZUS loss estimates, which depict damage at different flood levels and combined building stock data at flood risk at the census block level, which generally represents an area between 60 to 300 people with the average near 100 people, can provide valuable information that local planning and emergency managers can use to develop a mitigation plan's vulnerability assessment. Local officials may have more specific building inventory data, including critical facilities, which can be incorporated as user-entered data into HAZUS to be more site-specific and yield more refined results. The features and benefits of this dataset include: it identifies areas of higher flood risk by census block, estimates value of future potential flood losses to existing structures, improves ability to identify effective mitigation actions, supports mitigation plan updates through improved risk quantification, supports disaster recovery planning by showing areas of highest expected damages. The intended users for this dataset include planners, developers, community officials, and emergency managers. The purpose and intended uses for areas of mitigation interest include the following: creating public and community awareness of issues affecting flooding and risk, providing locations and potential projects for communities to include in future mitigation plan updates and to develop mitigation projects, identifying interrelationships between upstream and downstream community issues within a watershed, showing examples to communities and the public of what types of mitigation has worked to reduce risk. What constitutes an area of mitigation interest? It can be almost anything that helps identify positive or negative impacts on flooding, including elements that affect flood risks for identified flood hazards, opportunities for mitigation, and past mitigation projects. Examples include riverine flood control structures such as dams and levees, at-risk essential facilities and emergency routes that could be overtopped, stream flow constrictions such as undersized culverts and bridge openings, previous assistance and claims hotspots such as clusters of individual assistance and public assistance claims, repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, significant land use changes, significant riverine erosion, and locations of successful mitigation projects. Areas of mitigation interest are usually identified during the discovery process but may be added to or validated during the project. With the versatility of the database, depending on the data availability and RiskMAP products that are included in a project, a community can use the data to develop additional data sets based on the community's needs. The maps depicted on this slide demonstrate an alternative risk assessment that was performed with varying weighted factors, including percentage of census block in the floodplain, displaced populations, and potential losses.